Psalm 2 is one of the many places in the Bible where we are told to rejoice. Rejoice, be joyful, be glad. That phrases like that come up so many places in the Bible. But Psalm 2 puts an interesting twist on our rejoicing when it completes the sentence. When you read the whole sentence, it doesn't just say rejoice. It says rejoice with trembling. You might tremble if you're cold, but that's not what it's talking about. You might also tremble if you're overwhelmed, if you feel afraid, if you've been humbled. But boy, is that an important verse then. Because it means that we have reasons to rejoice, God believes, in all those situations. It often doesn't feel like that, but it's the truth. It makes me think of one time Jesus interacted with his disciples where they were no doubt rejoicing, but they were rejoicing with trembling. They were in a boat, and a big storm came up, and the disciples were afraid. They were afraid they were going to die, and they weren't just afraid, they were critical of Jesus. Jesus was sleeping, taking a little nap in the in the boat, and the disciples had convinced themselves apparently that if Jesus really loved them, he would have woken up all on his own and he would do something about it. And so they decided to wake up Jesus. They woke up Jesus, and then they said something to him. They said, "Don't you care? Don't you care if we drown?" I don't know how they felt saying that. But if it was smugness or arrogance or even just indifference, boy, did they feel something different in just a few seconds. Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves, just told them to stop. And they did. They did. They just stopped. And then he said to his disciples, "Why were you afraid? Do you still have such small faith?" And then the Bible wants us to know how the disciples felt after this. We can imagine that they rejoiced in having their lives saved, rejoiced that they weren't at the bottom of the sea somewhere, that they were still safe in the boat. But that's not what the Bible tells us. It says the disciples were terrified. They were terrified after the storm was calmed. After Jesus showed them how powerful he was, they were terrified standing in the presence of someone who could do something like that. They didn't know how to handle it. He was so much greater than they ever imagined. They were terrified. And that's a common response to God's greatness that we see in the Bible. Go back all the way to the Old Testament when God spoke the Ten Commandments to the Israelites. After he got done speaking, the Israelites came to Moses and they said, "Could you please, if you have to speak something like that to us again, if something has to be spoken like that, can you do it instead of God? Because that terrified us. It was terrifying." Every once in a while, God gave his people just a glimpse of how great he really is. And so frequently in the Bible, the people who saw it or caught it or witnessed it, they were terrified because of it. It was so much bigger than they would have ever imagined. They didn't know what to do with it. They were humbled. They were overwhelmed. They were afraid. And yet the disciples also rejoiced at the same time. And not only because they were safe, but because they must have realized at some point that the God who can do anything, who can rebuke the wind and the wind and the waves listen, the God who isn't afraid of a storm, who's so calm that he takes a nap in the middle of the worst of them, he was right there in the boat with them. He was right there in the boat with them, just as he is right there in the boat with you. And maybe life is terrifying for you at the moment. Maybe it's overwhelming. Maybe you're afraid of something. Jesus knows this about us. Life does this to us. We do this to us. But you can also rejoice. Because a God who is greater than any of us have the ability to imagine, He's right there with you. That's what Jesus on the cross means. That God is forever with you, eager to love you, eager to love you. Rest well tonight, my friends.